He was a reluctant revolutionary who defeated a superpower. He was a conservative landowner who became the revolutionary president of a brand new country. He is the father of the most powerful nation in the world, the United States of America. Through violent revolution, the fight for independence, and 2 terms as president, George Washington put the needs of his country above those of himself. Washington was born in 1732 into a prosperous family of planters at Westmoreland, Virginia, a colony of the British Crown. Like every ambitious young colonial, Washington was expected to adopt the ways of an English gentleman and travel to England for his education. But the death of his father, when he was just 11, put an end to all that. Instead, he was educated at home, but often escaped to see his stepbrother at his estate, Mount Vernon. By the age of 16, he was working as a surveyor in the then dangerous and uncharted wilderness of America's vast territory.
He was mathematically inclined, he had an artistic talent, very precise in his reasoning and thinking. It was a perfect job for him. And it was, a surveyor in those days was like a doctor or a lawyer. It was a significant and important profession.
Whilst falling in love with the Wild West, he'd become a confident and physically strong young man. And he was making lots of money. His brother's death in 1752 brought Washington home, and at 21, he enlisted as a young officer in the Virginia militia. When French colonial troops occupied land in the Ohio Valley, the British, longtime rivals for control of North America, were furious. Ambitious, brave, and determined to get a commission as a British officer, George Washington traveled over 500 miles to deliver a letter to the French on behalf of the Crown. It demanded their withdrawal.
It was a difficult job. Washington had had the surveying experience. He'd been out in the wilderness. He was eager to do it. But it is interesting that here's a young person at 21 given a fairly delicate and sensitive mission, as well as physically a difficult mission of traveling all the way almost to Lake Erie to deliver this series of messages and see what the French were up to.
The epic journey took 2 months, and only Washington's courage and strength kept him alive. With a single guide, he battled through deep snow, was attacked by Indians, and fell from a raft into the freezing Allegheny River. He returned in triumph to Williamsburg, the colonial capital of Virginia, and submitted his report.
Washington did it overnight. Dinwiddie looked over the report and published it. And Washington got a reputation throughout America and in Europe as well from publishing this report. This mission did exactly what Washington hoped it would, and that was to get his foot into the door of fame and fortune.
Emboldened by his success, Washington was dispatched with 160 men of the Virginia militia to force the French from the Ohio Valley. In May 1754, he ambushed a small French detachment, killing the commander. This incident was to spark a bitter 7-year war between France and Britain, which cost 1 million lives.
I think the event demonstrates his inexperience, his courage, his willingness to take chances, his daring, but his lack of maturity.
Washington was hailed a hero by some and promoted to full colonel. But his success was short-lived. Holed up in Fort Necessity on the Ohio River, it quickly became clear that he had vastly underestimated his enemy. When the French attacked, Washington and his men were quickly surrounded.
The French were willing to negotiate a settlement and allow Washington and his men to leave with full military honors as long as Washington signed a document which was in French, but unfortunately he basically confessed to assassinating a diplomat as opposed to a military activity. To his dying day, Washington said he was misled. He would never have signed that type of document.
On returning to Williamsburg, the army was reorganized. This meant that Washington was now outranked by every officer in the British Army. It was a humiliation he would never forget. But Washington's ambitions outweighed his wounded pride. When the British, under General Braddock, mounted another expedition to remove the French from the Ohio Valley, Washington volunteered immediately, eager to be in action.
There's a physicality to the man. He's a charismatic figure. He's over 6 feet 2 inches tall at a time when the average man is about 5'7" or 5'8". He's a superb athlete, perhaps the best horseman of his age, a man of tremendous physical power. There's something about his ability, even as a young man, that makes older men want to help him and young men want to fight with him and be with him. It's a very special, hard to define, but real quality.
His bravery was to reach incredible new heights when the French and their Indian allies ambushed Washington and General Braddock's expeditionary force. The battle that followed was brutal.
Washington showed incredible bravery under fire.
He simply had no fear of death. He himself ended up with 4 bullet holes through his clothes.
And 2 horses shot out from under him.
He was able to get the mortally wounded Braddock off the field. Even his worst enemy never doubted his personal courage.
His heroism and bravery enhanced his growing reputation as a leader of men. But still, he was refused what he really wanted, a commission into the British Army. Washington would spend 4 more frustrating years with the Virginia militia.
Well, George Washington at this stage in his career is not a very likable young man. He's extremely ambitious. He makes rash decisions. He complains a lot, and he tries to take a lot of credit to himself.
He left the war disappointed because he did not get the commission in the British Army that he had wished, and he thought that this would be the end of his national prominence. It turned out, of course, very differently.
Disillusioned with public life, Washington returned to Mount Vernon, the estate he had now inherited. He was 26 years old, and it was time he found a wife. A suitable candidate had appeared in the form of Martha Custis, a wealthy Virginia widow with 2 young children.
They had only known each other for a few weeks and only spent a few hours in each other's company before they were engaged. So this was definitely not a love match, although it did turn into one eventually.
The next 15 years were to be the happiest of his life. He was a member of the Virginia elite, and he fell in love with the estate at Mount Vernon.
He was constantly improving it, correcting it, experimenting with different things. This is where he loved to be. This is where he was most happy, entertaining, enjoying life as a Virginia gentleman.
He was an innovative farmer, surprising his fellow Virginians when he changed from growing the traditional tobacco to wheat. But it made Mount Vernon flourish, and aided by the land he had purchased as a young surveyor, he was becoming a man of significant wealth. A wealth the British were more than willing to tax. And tax heavily. For Washington, it was taxation without representation, and he was not a man to take this lying down.